The 2022 inflation scam revealed. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over how the CPI measurement, the headline CPI that you hear in the news all the time, is being changed. Let's first go back to the 1990s. This is when the BLS, or the BS, if you prefer, maybe the data put out by the BLS is actually the BS. I'll let you be the judge. Back in the 1990s, they changed the CPI, the headline CPI number that you hear about in the news all the time, from a cost of goods index to a cost of living index. And one of the ways they did this, or a couple ways they did this, is they used something called hedonic adjusting. Most of you know what that is. I'll explain it briefly. And substitution. So what they did initially is take a basket of goods and services, and they just measured how much did the prices increase from year to year. Makes a lot of sense. But then what they did is say, oh, actually, we need a cost of living index. That would be better. And it just happens to be coincidental that this dramatically understates the rate of inflation compared to the way it was measured prior to changing it to a cost of living index. But hedonics is basically as the quality of a good goes up, even though the price goes up, they don't see that as the price changing. So as an example, if you got a car, or if the average car costs $30,000, if the quality goes up, but the price goes up to $40,000, if the increase in quality was consistent with the increase in price, they'd say, oh, well, cars still cost $30,000, and there would be no price increase in the basket of goods and services. Substitution, most of you know what this is. This is if the price of your steak goes from $10 a pound up to $15 a pound. They just say, well, you're going to substitute the beef or the steak, the filet mignon, for hamburger. So you're still eating beef. Therefore, the quality of your life, your standard of living, pretty much stayed the same. Therefore, we're just going to assume that the steak did not go up in price because you have something that's still made of beef that you can use as a substitute. But now what they're doing in 2022, right here, is they're changing the weighting of the actual CPI. For more on this, editor, let's cut to the internet. And they don't give us much detail here, but they say starting in January 2022, weights for the consumer price index will be calculated based on consumer expenditure data from 2019 and 2020. So this change is going to be absolutely huge. I'm going to explain why in steps 2 and 3. But before we get there, let's go over kind of a diagram or a visual as to how this weighting system works from the BLS. So we've got shelter right here. This represents 32.39% of the overall CPI metric. So as an example, if shelter goes up by, let's say, 1%, but everything else on the board goes up by 10%, the CPI isn't going to read 9%. It's going to read something closer to maybe 3 or 4%. Why? When 90% of this has gone up by 10%, because they're giving shelter a higher weight. For a few more examples, food, second place, 13.99%. And within each of these categories, it gets very specific, but this is kind of the overall summary. And it goes down to energy, education, transport, household furnishings. We've got medical at 6.99, recreation 3.67, all the way down to education, commodities, not sure what that is, at 0.47. So the weighting they give each one of these categories makes a huge difference in the headline CPI number that you see in the financial media. So the questions then become, how did the BLS change these inputs to the overall CPI inflation metric? And will those changes understate CPI even more than it's been understated in the past. Step number 2, the C-CPI-U versus the CPI-U. This actually holds the key for us to determine if these changes that the BLS is making to how they measure the CPI will understate it even more moving into the future. Let's start by looking at a chart going back to 2000 all the way to today's date. On the left, this is an index, so we go from 90 up to 150. Now this blue line represents the CPI-U. This is the headline CPI number or inflation number that you hear in the financial media. This red line represents a different way of measuring it. This is called the C-CPI-U. They started measuring it this different way for a variety of reasons, but the key here, first of all, is to realize this started in 2002. Now, I also want to point out that in 2018, there was something that was very important that happened. If you guys go back, you'll remember that we had the Trump tax cuts in 2018. But you'll notice right here on the board that the average Joe and even Moody the millennial are very pissed off about these tax cuts. Well, why would they be pissed if their taxes were actually lowered? Because they've been watching my videos and they read the fine print when those tax cuts came out. And it is true that some of the tax rates came down, but what most people don't realize is they secretly changed the metric for inflation for the tax brackets moving forward from the CPI to the C-CPI-U. And again, this was the metric that understates inflation to an even greater degree. So let's think this through. If they're moving the tax brackets up at a slower rate than the real rate of inflation, then you are going to pay more taxes. Here's how it would work. Let's say that your wages go up just with the rate of inflation. And for the sake of the example, let's say right now you're making $50,000 and your wages go up to $100,000. Now keep in mind, they're just going up with the rate of inflation. So you don't have any more purchasing power. But if the tax brackets don't move up at the same rate, you're going to go from, let's say, a 33% tax bracket to a 39% tax bracket. So again, you, the average Joe and Jane watching this video right now, would pay more or a higher percentage of your income to taxes, even though your purchasing power didn't increase at all. That's the dirty little secret that they don't want you to know. And I'm using this as an example for multiple reasons. Number one, we want to see how the C-CPI-U actually changed, because that's very important for the topic of this video. But number two, I really want to illustrate the point that the government pulls the wool over your eyes all the time with numbers, statistics, and the way they measure things. So my point is, if they're willing to screw you over regarding the quote-unquote tax cuts, why on earth wouldn't they be willing to screw you over today with the changes in the way they're measuring headline CPI? So we know this specific methodology for measuring CPI occurred in 2002. And the way they changed the numbers gave them a CPI metric that actually understated inflation even more than the headline CPI. But then the question becomes, what did they do to change the existing CPI measurement back in 2002? And why did those changes result in such a dramatically understated CPI measurement that the government can now use to screw you over? I'm going to reveal everything to you right now. Editor, let's go to the internet. And this is right from the BLS's website. The Chained Consumer Price Index, or C-CPI-U, a supplemental index introduced in 2002, uses updated expenditure weights. Let me read that one more time, guys. Uses updated expenditure weights. And as would be expected, it tends to run slightly lower than the regular CPI. So why does this red line show lower rates of inflation than the blue line? Because back in 2002, they changed the weighting of the CPI. But let's go back to step number one. Editor, let's go ahead and throw up the three things that they changed. Number one was hedonics. Number two was substitution. But number three, and this is how they're changing the CPI right now as we speak, 2022, they're changing the weighting, just like they did back in 2002, that yielded a new CPI measurement that understates inflation to an even greater degree than the existing CPI measured it in the past. And you may be saying to yourself right now, okay, George, I get it, but why would the politicians want a lower rate of inflation for that headline CPI number? Well, let's think this through. I always say there are no certainties, there are only probabilities. But the one thing that we can say that is certain is the fact the politicians' number one priority is getting reelected. And what's the best thing that you can do to make sure you do not get reelected? Have high consumer price inflation. So I think the politicians look at this and they say, well, we can't get reelected if inflation is running hot and there's nothing we can do about inflation because we have to have it for a variety of different reasons. Therefore, instead of battling inflation, actually bringing prices down, we'll just adjust the measurement. And this is the 2022 CPI scam. Step number three. Now let's go over the specific details to how they are changing the measurement, and then we can connect the dots. And I can promise you, at the end of this video, give it about 2 or 3 minutes, you are going to look exactly like the average Joe and Moody the Millennial. In other words, you're going to be pissed. So sit down and pour yourself that drink because it is definitely stiff drink time. Editor, let's go right back to the internet. So this is very exciting, guys, because the BLS's report for January just came out. And this is the first month that they made these changes to the CPI that will be in place indefinitely into the future. So what we can do is we can pull up the CPI print and the details from December of 2021. We can compare that to January of 2022, and we can see the changes to determine if these changes are going to understate inflation to an even greater degree, allowing the politicians to further pull the wool over your eyes and claim that consumer price inflation is a lot lower than it actually is in the real economy. Let's dive right into the numbers. So again, this is the January 2022 report. The first thing that I want to highlight is food is 13.37%. And this is the weighting that they allocate to food in the CPI metric. So the more weighting they give a specific input, the more impact it has on the overall CPI print. So now let's see the weight they gave food back in December of 2021. So we can see if there was a change. Well, right here in December of 21, it was 13.99%. So what that tells us is in January of 2022, the change they made was to reduce the weighting allocated to food. I wonder why on earth they do that. Maybe it's because food prices have skyrocketed. That's why. So if food prices are skyrocketing, the government's solution It's just, well, we'll tweak the numbers so food doesn't impact the overall CPI to the same degree. Absolutely. You can't make this stuff up. And this is why the average Joe, Moody, the millennial on the whiteboard, and probably you right now watching this video are so pissed off. You know they are lying to you. Oh, but wait, there is more. Let's go down and look at prices for automobiles. In January, they allocate 4.1% or 4.105% weight to new vehicles and 4.143 to used cars and trucks. And as you guys know, the prices of used cars and new cars, for that matter, have skyrocketed over the last year and a half. So let's compare this to the way it was in December of 2021 to see if there was a significant change. So for December, new vehicles was a 3.884 weighting. Used cars and trucks was a 3.419 weighting. So the weight they allocated to vehicles was lower in December of 2021. So they increased the weighting for the new measurement. Why would they do this? Well, car prices have gone up by, let's say, 30 or 40%. And this is because of chip shortages and a variety of issues that are most likely temporary. So if they see a metric or an input where the likelihood is high that the prices will actually go down slightly in the future, then they're going to give that a higher weight because the impact that has on the overall CPI number will to artificially bring it down. And again, that's their objective. And as you would expect, the shenanigans don't end there. Let's go to another metric that's very important to all of us, housing. So most of you realize that shelter in the CPI is the highest weighted input. It's at 32.946%. But let's focus on the details. It's broken down by rent of primary residence and owner's equivalent rent. You guys know that the rent you're paying right now is far greater than it was in 2019. And the prices of the homes you're trying to buy is also much, much greater than the prices you would have paid back in 2019. So let's go to a chart to see how much the government is admitting to shelter or housing increases over the past 12 months to compare that to what you are seeing in reality, in the real economy. So they are saying that over the past 12 months, going back to December, that housing costs increased by 3.79%. Any of you watching this video, have you seen your rent increase by 3.79% or more than 3.79%? In fact, if we go to realtor.com, which is basically mining the MLS, they show that rents have increased by over 12% over the past 12 months or so. And we all know that housing in pretty much every area across the United States has gone up more than just 3.79% over the last 12 months. So this is a completely bogus, fabricated number. But the BLS, or the BS in this case, gives the overall weighting to owner's equivalent rent at 24.251% in January of 2022. So let's see if this has changed. Going back to December, it was 23.509%. That means the weighting they're giving owners equivalent rents has increased with this new methodology. And why is this change beneficial to them? Because it's a completely fabricated number in the first place. So if you give the fabricated number a greater and greater weighting or a bigger impact on the overall CPI print, this gives you the ability to lie about actual price inflation to an even greater extent. So they've changed the weighting on food, cars, and housing. 3 things that really aren't that important to the average American. Hopefully you can sense my sarcasm there. But I want to point out, I want to be very, very clear. These aren't the only 3 things that they have changed in the way they're calculating CPI. I'm going to do a deep dive on the Rebel Capitalist channel today. And I also want to point out that the new CPI print came out today and it was through the roof. CPI has skyrocketed up to 7.5%. So this is a story that we are going to have to pay a lot of attention to in the future. But the main takeaway from this video is to understand that back in 2002, they changed the weighting for one of the CPI measurements they were using, the C-CPI-U, and this drastically lowered inflation 20 years into the future. And I believe that if you look at the way they just changed the CPI methodology today, that moving out 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the headline CPI is going to understate the rate of consumer price inflation to an even greater degree than it did in the past. And this is the 2022 CPI scam that they don't want you to know about. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.